أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على رسوله الكريم وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. My name is Merium Khan, and I am the founder of the MuslimEducator.com. And we're bringing you this webinar tonight to discuss an issue that is of great interest and importance to a lot of people. And it is the issue of teaching from the heart. And we've titled this webinar, Teaching from the Heart. And in it, we are going to be discussing the two concepts of tarbiyah and ta'aleem. And I won't give it away just yet, what is tarbiyah and what is ta'aleem, but you guys already have a general idea that we're going to be discussing education, the state of Muslim education today, and what we're doing right, what we're doing wrong, and how we can change it. Because as we'll discuss, you know, we as a Muslim community are in a bit of crisis, and that's where this organization, the Muslim Educator, comes in, and one of the reasons I started it. So what we're going to do tonight is we're going to start. We have three panelists tonight. I have myself, my husband, Siraj Sohail, and another instructor, Brother Tom Facchine. And what we're going to be doing is we'll each introduce ourselves briefly and our connection to the subject matter of tarbiyah, of raising and teaching children. And then we will go ahead and discuss. And the way it's going to work is it's going to be it's going to be a little different. You know, it's going to be like a discussion. So the three of us are going to be discussing it with each other and with you. And so what that means is at any time, feel free to click on the button that you have there that says to raise your hand. Feel free to click on the button that says Q&A and submit a question. If you click the raise hand button, I can allow you to use your microphone and ask a question or make a comment. You can also use the chat box to submit a question or comment as well. And we welcome any questions or comments. And this is designed to be a workshop type of experience where you give your contributions and we give as well. So to start, my connection with the subject of tarbiyah actually started when I was in high school. And when I was in high school, I came across a book in the library written by John Holt, and the book was called Teach Your Own. And in it, he put forth a really interesting argument for the idea of parents teaching their own children. And nowadays, you know, the idea of homeschooling is very common, but at John Holt's time, it was not. And so he talks about, you know, he talked about education as, you know, he talked about the idea of parents reclaiming their child's education, and he really focused a lot on the relationship between parents and children, and how many times the school system could dull the students' interest in learning and really just make them not want to learn at all. So that's a little idea kind of stuck in my head from then. Shortly thereafter, I convinced my parents to start homeschooling myself, and then I started college shortly thereafter as well. And through this process, you know, I've been I also started teaching and working with students. And what I found when I was trying to teach Muslim students is that a lot of the books that were available as far as curriculum were just not meeting my students' needs. You know, I had to teach them Sirah. And so I'm trying to teach about the life of the Prophet ﷺ, and the homework assignments and the readings just ask them, list the daughters of the Prophet ﷺ, and or do a little word search about simple things like that. And I didn't feel like that was giving them a sense of, you know, who is the greatness of this man and the lessons behind his life. And so I started writing materials from then. So fast forward till today, the idea behind the Muslim Educator Academy is to bring education to students in a way that strikes their hearts. It's not, so learning is not just an intellectual exercise of, okay, I'm going to learn these facts and put it in my fact bucket. It's about, you know, stoking the fire of their passion for the deen their interest, their iman. And so that's what we do here. We focus on education that interests students, that helps them to want to learn about Islam, that focuses on meaning. And so that's what we're going to do today. We're going to talk about this approach. We're going to talk about the existing problems and what some of the solutions could be, and how you can implement the ideas of tarbiyah and ta'aleem, whether that be in, well, primarily we're going to focus on the home, not so much the classroom, but these lessons can be taken and applied in the classroom as well. So with that, I will turn it over to my husband, Siraj. You can go ahead and introduce yourself, and then we'll move on to Sheikh Tom.
Assalamu alaikum. My name is Maria mentioned, my name is Siraj, and this topic primarily interests me because I've been involved with teaching and educating for maybe 15, 17 years. When I graduated college in 2002 or so, my first job out actually was in an Islamic school teaching middle schoolers, and I noticed from then and kind of from then till now is that there's a lot of knowledge that's out there, and the access to knowledge is relatively easy to get now with the internet and with all of the other resources available. But when there's no tarbiyah, there's no spiritual component behind it, it's very easy to be negatively impacted by the different isms that are out there, the different thought, all these different things people are going through right now. But when there's this concept of why we worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and that underlies everything else we do, and that becomes the focus and the crux of our lives, it becomes much more easy, and life makes much more sense when there is a spiritual component, and then there is a component of doing things for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And obviously this is a struggle we all go through, and as parents, as adults, as teachers, as whoever we are, this is a struggle we all go through, is trying to make Islam meaningful and relevant in our lives, and also making it meaningful and relevant in the lives of those people who we have an impact with and who we interact with on a daily basis. So that's kind of why this topic interests me, and why I feel like it's important for us to spend some time thinking about it and coming up with, as a group, some strategies and some ideas to make Islam more part of our lives beyond just knowing the basic facts, making it part of who we are, and kind of being people who truly worship Allah from sincerity and out of love of Him. So that's kind of a brief introduction about me and why I think this topic is relevant and why I'm interested and looking forward to the seminar, inshallah.
Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wassalatu wassalamu ala ashrafil anbiya'i wal mursaleen. Nabiyana wa qudwatina Muhammad alayhi afdalu salat wa azka taslim. My name is Tom. I'm a convert to Islam. I'm a student at the University of Medina in Saudi Arabia, in the Kuliya, the Faculty of Islamic Law, and a recent addition to the Muslim Legend, and a proud one at that. What drives my passion for this topic is primarily my own childhood, and what I would say is the lack of tarbiyah that I grew up with, coupled with the fact that for non-Muslims, you simply don't have this sort of tradition to fall back on as much as Muslims do who are growing up. Even the most astray Muslim youth, I think, in the back of their minds kind of know that if things really go south and really turn sour, they know the right way to get back. They know that there's prayer and there's Quran and there's going to the masjid and these sorts of things. And they kind of have these roads and avenues available to them. So it's available to them. And obviously we know how rich the Islamic tradition is, and the text of the Quran is the speech of Allah, and the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ, how complete and exhaustive and comprehensive it is. So to have all of that at our disposal is an immense benefit. It's an immense blessing. And one of the things I try to impart on Muslims who were raised in a Muslim family is not taking that for granted, because for the person who doesn't grow up with that, you know what's wrong. You literally don't know what to fall back on. And so when I became a Muslim, And I started getting involved with community, and I started getting involved with youth especially. I was able to direct a couple youth groups, and that was really a positive experience before I went to Medina. And I saw the kinds of things that the Muslim youth were exposed to. You know, it really hit home that the benefit of this rich tradition is very minimal. And the amount that the average Muslim youth understands from this tradition is very, very minimal. And that was something that would just keep coming back to me as eventually I was able to go to Medina. I would come back in the summers and do programs at local masajid, usually teaching youth. So I was very kind of plugged in to what was going on, the conversations that they were having, the influences that they were exposed to, and their preparation and what they kind of, how they related to their tradition. And to say it was flimsy is generous, right? It was extremely, extremely tenuous, often non-existent. So that was something that really, really drove me. Also, I have a degree from before I went to Medina in political theory. I also I was a couple credits short, a minor in education, so I'm interested in education. I've always kind of read, and now as a homeschool parent, I have 2 children, and my children are also homeschooled. Kind of when I'm on break, I'm always reading about childhood development and education and other things in order to be a better homeschool parent. So these are things that are kind of always kind of circling in my mind and in my heart, and it's a very dear subject to me. So what we're going to do today, or kind of the structure of the little conversation that we've prepared, and of course, being a conversation, we're open to it going in other directions that we didn't initially plan. But how we kind of, or at least I kind of conceived of it, is getting to an open-ended question about Muslim education or Islamic education. Oftentimes, issues when we're not the dominant factor in society, like in the United States or other Western countries, it's kind of easy to get sucked into like this either or. What's your stance on abortion? What's your stance on gay marriage? What's your stance on this? And the 2 sides are very, very, they're already established for you. And so it's very easy to kind of get sucked into the existing boxes. One of the things I love to do is try to take it back to an open-ended question. Because when you take it back to an open-ended question, it gives you more space to kind of think and ponder about what our tradition really says in a comprehensive way. So the open-ended question for me here is, what does an Islamic philosophy of education look like? What does an Islamic philosophy of education look like, and how is that different from the prevalent philosophies of education that exist today, that are being practiced today, and we've kind of probably unknowingly adopted in our instruction of Islam to our children, just by virtue of being as Muslim minorities in a non-Muslim country, or even teaching in the English tongue. So basically, the first part of this regards assessing the current situation, kind of taking an inventory of the things on the ground, as all of us have kind of noticed as educators, and then kind of getting back to talking about very fundamentally, who are our children? Because talking about who they are and kind of a cosmology, if you will, like an ontology of who we are is going to inform how we are going to approach them and educate them. And then we're going to talk about kind of the other elephants in the room. What are the main ways that our children are imagined and thus taught in the dominant society? How do those ways converge with Islam and Islamic imperatives, and how do they diverge? And finally, some very, very nuts and bolts things about what we all can be doing better in order to make Islam something that nests and settles in the hearts of our youth, to preserve Islam for our families and our generations, and also to establish Islam, inshallah, in a Western country. So the current situation, I shouldn't have to tell you, is very, very bleak. When we're talking about what is the educational model that we are implementing in most of our Islamic schools, most of our Sunday school programs, most of our after-school programs, the things that are covered tend to stick to and not stray far from the basics of ritual practice and creed. How to pray, who is Allah, what is idolatry, these sorts of things. Rarely do we get into the texts themselves, talk about how Allah discusses these phenomenon, how does the Prophet ﷺ talk about them. The other pillar of our current contemporary educational model is memorization. Pretty much most parents, when they want to, if they have kind of an inspiration and they want their children to start, getting more religious, quote unquote, it's memorizing the Quran. And obviously that's a great thing. We know, and we don't have to talk about how that's a great thing. However, in the vast, vast, vast majority of situations, it's a memorization that is without understanding at all. Even to the point where people who have exceeded our expectations, have even completed memorizing the Quran, have a very, very, very poor understanding of not only what the Quran says or what Allah says via the Quran, but what the Quran is. What we see in these settings, we see an increasing push to tokenize Islamic education. Islamic studies and even the Quran is a appendage. It's a side subject. It's an elective. It's kind of like music class or PE or art class or something like that. The nuts and bolts, what everybody's concerned about today, obviously, is pretty much STEM and other sort of employable topics and subjects. And the Islamic subjects are kind of an afterthought, if they are thought of at all. We'll get into why this is the way it is in a bit, inshallah. So, as Islam as a single subject, and not the broader worldview in which all of the other subjects are taught, we start to see the problematic nature. Think about all of those electives that your children do, or the other kids that go to your child's school do. Most of them, it's just kind of to pass the time. It's kind of like an appreciation course. And the understanding is eventually they're going to move past it and do something kind of quote unquote real with their lives. So if that's the space that we're inhabiting, and that's the space that we're allotting to Islamic education, I don't think we have any right to expect fantastic results. I don't really think we have a right to expect that the religion is going to be established very firmly in the next generation at all. Obviously, you need to mention about how with system, Muslims are affected by the same type of vices as mainstream society. There's a very permeable kind of boundary between the two, and the people, the good kids, even the best kids, don't really end up necessarily that much different from their peers in the public schools. So with this in mind, knowing that just rote memorization isn't going to save anybody. It's not a vaccine. It's not an inoculation against Western culture, against sin, against being a slave to your desires. What do we do? Before we answer what we do, we have to get to the basic elements of what is a human being in Islam, and thus who are our children, that we may teach them. What are the goals of education in the first place? When we talk about the idea of the self in Islam, many things can be said. The first and the obvious one that everybody says first is that the human being in Islam is a servant of Allah. Now, Allah said in the Quran that I have not created the jinn and human beings except that they worship me. But there's more than that. Often we stop at this point and we kind of, conversation over. But when Allah talks about the human being in the Quran, and when the Prophet ﷺ talks about the human being and what it fundamentally is in the Sunnah, there's more to be said. And the other things that are being said are very, very, very important for us and understanding ourselves. One of these things is that Allah tells us that we are stewards of this earth and that we are His representative. We are Allah's representative on earth. Allah said, وَهُوَ الَّذِي جَعَلَ لَكُمْ خَلَائِفَ الْأَرْضِ, that He's the one who has made us, made you, in the ayah, successors, literally, figuratively, stewards, representatives of Allah upon this earth. And obviously the statement of Allah, وَهُوَ الَّذِي خَلَقَ لَكُم مَّا فِي الْأَرْضِ جَمِيعًا, that Allah created this entire creation for us. Now, lakum, for us, it can mean in the sense of for our benefit, but it can also mean in the sense that we have a responsibility to it. And there's other ahadith in the Sunnah that bear that out, that we have an obligation to uphold when it comes to how we relate to this creation. So we're servants of Allah, we are representatives of Allah on earth, and third, we are relationally situated. We are people with relations. I was thinking, it's funny because when we have these kind of like instructor bios, or we usually get an introduction, what are the things that we normally mention? We normally mention, okay, so-and-so, he was born here, and he studied here, he has a degree from here, and he knows this, and he knows that, and he knows that. All of those things that we typically mention fall within an individualistic paradigm. None of those things have to do with a relationship that the person has. For example, what if I were to tell you that I am the great-grandson of an Italian immigrant coal miner, and I am the grandson of a carpenter, and these sorts of things. In Islam, the human being is primarily a relational being. He's caught up with these other relations. He's not an island. He's not off by himself. And there are many, many, many hadith that bear this out. Remember the person who approached the Prophet ﷺ asking to permit him to commit zina. And what was the response of the Prophet ﷺ? He goes to the relationships right away. He says, would you like it for your mother? Would you like it for your daughter? Would you like it for your sister? Would you like it for your cousin or your aunt? And he keeps going until the man is kind of talked down. Because when the man was thinking about his lust and his desire, he was only thinking about himself as an individual. And he was only thinking about the person he wanted to do that with as an individual. When the Prophet ﷺ reminded him, nobody is an individual. That woman is somebody's daughter. That woman is somebody's sister. And you yourself have daughters and have sisters. So imagine, in that way, the Prophet ﷺ built empathy. The human being is fundamentally a relational being. We are caught up in these relations, and it's not a burden. In fact, it's what defines us and what purifies us. The Prophet ﷺ also used to have the practice of calling people by their kunya, Abu so-and-so or so-and-so. And even children, people who didn't have children yet. The Prophet ﷺ would call them by a kunya as an honorific, because when you're calling someone by a kunya, you're kind of gesturing to this fact of nature that they are not an individual. They are, in fact, tied up within a relation, a web of relations, and that web of relations is extremely important. Abu Bakr, before Islam, was famous for this. He knew everybody's family histories. He knew everybody's tribal histories, and people would actually come to him asking him about what their ancestors had done. This is something that was a good thing that was practiced before Islam that continued after Islam.
Tom, can I interrupt you real
Yes,
quick? I think your
please, of course.
internet might be having some issues because your video's breaking up quite a bit, and sometimes the audio. Are you able to either shift to a different position where it might connect better, or different
Yeah,
network?
I can try. 1 second.
Okay. I can also
Yeah.
okay. No, I was saying if it still is an issue, another thing you can do, if you stop your video, if it continues to do that, that might give you more bandwidth for the audio so it doesn't break up. But you can try shifting and see if that works.
Okay. Let me know if it persists, and I will. I'll do that. Okay.
Okay. Yeah, if it keeps breaking up, what I'll do is I think from here I can stop your video, so it'll just show your name instead of your video, and then hopefully that
Okay.
might help.
Yeah. If that's what happens, just go ahead and do it. No problem. Okay. So the Prophet ﷺ, in addition, he notified people that paradise is at the feet of one's parents, and especially one's mother. And the Prophet ﷺ also informed us that marriage, they're all things that have to do with relationships. So it's something, and this is why this is important. Why am I? We're here to talk about education. Why am I talking about relationships? Why am I talking about all of this stuff? We're going to see in just a moment, inshallah. The question now is, what are the other ideas that are going on here? What are the other ideas of the self? And why are we talking about the self? Because who we imagine the individual to be, or who we imagine a person to be in Islam or outside of Islam, affects how we're going to teach that person. There are other ideas of who a human being is that dominate our society. We're going to go through a couple of them. One of these ideas is that the person is primarily an earner, meaning an income earner, or a consumer. We see this very, very often with our priorities. We want our children to be doctors, engineers, lawyers, marketable. We want them to have a nice big home in the suburbs. We want them to have 2 cars that are new. We want them to have these sorts of things. Nothing's wrong essentially with these sorts of things, but we're doing a thought exercise here. If you're imagining, or if the society is imagining each child as primarily an earner and a potential consumer, then what is significant to teach that child? Is spiritual intelligence going to be significant to teach that child? Is emotional intelligence going to be significant? What's going to be significant is teaching marketable skills. And that's what we see today with the push. There's a huge push towards STEM. The liberal arts are faux pas. They're out the door. Our society is turning towards this because this is what it values. Another idea, or another lens through which we can view the human individual, is as a citizen. The person, their main responsibility is to their government. It's to fight in wars for whatever reason. It's to vote. It's to participate in local government, all these sorts of things. And so if that's how we're primarily imagining the individual, if that's how we're imagining our children, then what's the imperative? The imperative is that we should be teaching them civics and governance and liberal arts and things that are going to develop them in order to be productive and beneficial influences for the society. The third and last conception of the self we're going to talk about, and this one is probably most important for our discussion today, is imagining each person, and each child especially, as an autonomous individual. This goes deep within the philosophy of liberalism. This goes to Locke and Hobbes and Descartes. It goes to much of what liberal Western society is built upon. What is this conception? This conception is that the person, every single person, is first and foremost an individual. And every single relationship that they have in their lives, every single association, is the basis of whenever one desires. And often these relationships and these sort of associations are hindrances, and they work against the individual.
Your audio is breaking up a lot right now. It's difficult to understand. Yeah, are you able to try to shift position? See if that works. Or to be closer to your router, maybe.
Yeah. Is that okay? I very few bars. Okay. How's that?
I mean, it's
How
still
much
showing up.
better?
It's still showing up on my screen as red. You know, like your connection is weak, but we'll keep trying. I'll let you know if it breaks up again.
Okay. Okay, that's fine. So this sort of ideology teaches that everybody is in full ownership of themselves and that it has no fundamental responsibilities to other people or to other entities or to other groups. And we're going to see, obviously, how this jives with or doesn't jive with an Islamic conception of the self and what it means for education. So now we're going to look at, okay, we have these three ideas, these three conceptions of the self. We have an earner or a consumer, we have a citizen, and we have an autonomous individual. And we're going to say, what does Islam have to say about these sorts of things? Are these sorts of ideas mutually exclusive? Do they come together? Do they depart? And where?
And can
When it comes to
can I add a
yes,
bit
please.
here when we talk about the idea of the individual? It's important to recognize. I would encourage everyone to, you know, from here on out, start to examine the influences as far as media and as far as media, literature. Just look at the news and the way issues are framed, and look and see how oftentimes how often the bias is towards the conception of the self as an individual, and you'll start to get an understanding of how this is perhaps the biggest threat to the development of the student or the child's sense of self as a servant of Allah. I mean, even the you know, the movies, the typical kids movies, um, you know, every single Disney or what have you, any animated film, the theme always comes back to the self. You know, live your best life. You know, your parents are going to be against you becoming a um, human if you're a mermaid or a singer or a following your dreams, and they're going to want you to work in the family business, and you're going to, you know, so all of these ideas that your parents are always trying to bring you down, you have to you know, go follow your heart. Everything is constantly pushing kids in that direction of that individualism. And the other aspect of that is also ultimately what that's doing is it's encouraging a type of worship of one's own nafs. And that's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he says in the Quran, أَفَرَأَيْتَ مَنِ اتَّخَذَ إِلَهَهُ هَوَى. Have you seen the one who takes his desires as his God? وَأَضَلَّهُ اللَّهُ عَلَى عِلْمٍ وَخَتَمَ عَلَى سَمْعِهِ وَقَلْبِهِ وَجَعَلَ عَلَى بَصَرِهِ غِشَاوَةً. That, you know, this person who takes their own desires as their God, and whatever I feel is right, that's what I'm going to follow. You know, this is the person that their hearing and their heart and their eyes, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala puts a seal on it then, because they're just, that is their ilah, that is the thing that they end up worshiping. And so this is the biggest threat, and we have to really be cognizant of it as we go on and we see the influences all around us. Go ahead.
Thank you very much for that. So looking at these different conceptualizations, how do they match up or compare or contrast with that of Islam's? When it comes to the first two, imagining the individual as an earner or a consumer, and imagining the individual as a citizen. Comparing this to Islam, it's not necessarily mutually exclusive. Yeah, thank you. I moved up from the basement. That's why the audio is better. I was in the basement, and I guess it was blocking my.
You can go ahead. Do you want me to? You can start your video if you want to see if that works.
Let's see how it goes. The lighting isn't going to be as good, but Just 1 second, inshallah.
The advantage of technology is that it can bring people from all around the world together. The disadvantages are obvious.
That's right. I was trying to get away from the kids, and so I went to the basement, but I didn't realize the connection would be so poor. So that's better. Okay, bismillah. So the idea that the person is a citizen or a good citizen, and the person is an earner or a consumer, is not inherently mutually exclusive with the idea of the person in Islam. That is because the Prophet ﷺ and Allah Azza wa Jalla in the Quran have commanded us to take care of our financial needs. We have been commanded to earn an income and to be useful and productive people. It's a duty to yourself, it's a duty to your community, and it's a duty to one's family. The Prophet ﷺ, he said, by him in whose hand is my soul, if one of you were to carry a bundle of firewood on his back and sell it, that would be better for him than begging somebody for money. That's in Bukhari. Now, where it diverges is that this idea of the person as an earner or a consumer is bound by what is permissible in Islam. So people can't just buy whatever they want, and people can't just earn in any old way. You can't earn your income in a way that contravenes or contradicts or goes against the rules of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Similarly, our ability to earn is bound by responsibility. It's not unequivocal. We have zakat to pay. You have the people around you and the community around you, the poor around you have obligations upon you. And that's something that has to be taken into account. Just like being an earner, being a good citizen is also something commanded by Allah Azza wa Jal and His Messenger. Being a good influence to your community. Being an upright person, pitching in, helping out, all of these sorts of things. However, just like being an earner, it is inflected and it is bound by our responsibilities in Islam. It's bound by what is permissible. So if the nation says that we have to go abroad and fight and kill Muslims, we know that we can't do that. And it's also bound by our responsibility towards other Muslims. Where we really get into trouble is when we're looking at this third conception of personhood, which Merium, mashallah, she talked about a little bit. We're talking about the idea that the person is just an individual, we would say an atomistic individual, an autonomous individual, a self-owning individual. This is something that is very, very foreign to Islam. Something that contradicts and undermines a lot of Islamic imperatives and purposes. Getting to just the idea of who owns us. In Islam, we know that we don't even own ourselves. Everything that we've been given, our bodies, our intellects, our senses, our abilities, our potentials, they're all in the dominion of Allah Azza wa Jal, first and foremost. They're given to us on loan. They're something that we're given to for a limited number of years and that we are going to turn back into dust. This is very different from the conception of the self of the liberal, autonomous individual, in which my body, myself, everything is proprietary. It's not conceivable to abort or to kill an unborn human being inside of a womb unless you believe that you own yourself to the exclusion of any other responsibilities or imperatives. It also diverges when it comes to our relationship with our desires. And this is probably, if you walk away with one thing from this lecture, I would say this is one of the most important things. Just like Sister Merium was saying, listen, it's deep. We have multi-billion-dollar advertising industries trying to get our children to desire things that they didn't desire, to want things that they wouldn't want or shouldn't even want. And how are they accomplishing this? They're accomplishing this by television and by movies, especially the Disney movies that are really, really bad for the most part, by social media. We have reached the level of an epidemic. The entire ideology is based off of whatever you are doing, whatever desire rises up within your property, your body, you must act on it. You must express it. And if you don't express it, then this is going to lead to problems later on. You're having a repressed life. You're going to exhibit psychological problems or emotional problems. You're going to lash out. You're going to boil over one day. This is what we are fed. Obviously, the relationship to desire in Islam is something that is entirely contrary to this. When it comes to our desires, we recognize the fact that our desires are not who we are. They do not define us. They do not make up our identities. We don't build our identities upon the desires that happen within inside of us. No, the actual responsibility that we have is to master those desires and discipline those desires and rein them in, control them, bring them to heel. And that is exactly the tool of salvation. That's why we're on this earth in the first place, so that we can struggle against these desires and earn merit because of that, so that Allah, inshallah, enters us into his paradise. And we ask that for all of us, inshallah. It also diverges, Islam diverges from this idea of a self-owning, autonomous individual in its idea of freedom. Imagining every child as a self-owning, autonomous individual sets them up to feel every single relationship and every single obligation and responsibility as oppressive. In Islam, and not just Islam, in many traditional societies, these sorts of relationships, these sorts of obligations are actually the structure of your freedom. They are the scaffolding, the apparatus by which you achieve a meaningful life in this world and eternity in the next. So if these ideas of who a person is are so different, and they have such large consequences on our children and how we teach them, are we going to teach them that when they feel angry, they need to learn how to control it? Or when you feel angry, that you should just let it out, and that's being your authentic self? When they feel sexual desires, that they need to learn how to channel it in a proper way? Or when they feel sexual desires, they need to act on it and express it and explore it? When we notice all these differences, we have to ask, how do we nurture in this society, with all of the influences that we're exposed to, how do we implement and inculcate and plant the Islamic sense of self in our children? How do we do it at home? How do we do it in the classroom? And this is really what we're here to talk about. The first thing that comes to mind is building strong relationships. The Prophet ﷺ was the foremost when it came to this. You know, we like to say that the first thing that the da'wah, that the Prophet ﷺ's mission began with, was tawheed. And that's true if you start from when he began his call, when he got the revelation from Allah Azza wa Jal. But the Prophet ﷺ lived for 40 years before that. And that 40 years before he received revelation was entirely instrumental to the message that he would receive, to delivering it to the people he was going to deliver it to. And those 40 years before were all about purification and building relationships. The Prophet ﷺ had strong relationships with the people around him, even the people that would turn their backs on him and become enemies. The Prophet ﷺ was so trustworthy that it earned him a nickname. He was so trustworthy that he was given the honor of placing the black stone in the Kaaba when the companions were, when the Muslims, when the Quraysh were rebuilding the Kaaba when the Prophet ﷺ was 35, before the revelation. The Prophet ﷺ has such strong relationships that he left Ali behind in his house when he left for Hijrah in order to return every single valuable that his enemies, excuse me.
This is a good example of relationships in practice.
Relationships, that's right. Alhamdulillah. That's how the Prophet ﷺ was with his children. The Prophet ﷺ used to pray with his granddaughter in his arms. And obviously, you've all heard the stories about how the grandchildren, Hassan and Hussein, used to be climbing all over him. The point is, everybody loved the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ. Everybody wanted to be around him. Everybody hated to leave his company. He was the par excellence of developing relationships and getting people to truly love you. Not for what you're doing for people, but because of how you treat people. When we look at our relationships with our children, we have a long way to go. We blow them off. We treat them as if they're not important. We don't respect them. We don't even schedule time for them in our schedules. Most of us, and I'm talking, mostly for the men here, this is a problem more for the men than it is for the women, but especially men. We imagine that our responsibility is leaving the house, making money, putting it on the table, and that's a day. That is not enough. That is never enough in any society, especially not in the society that we live in presently. We are busy on our smartphones, and we give our children smartphones way too early so that they are distracted and our relationships are even more frayed. I used to be a waiter in restaurants for a long time before I went to Medina, and in the beginning when I became a Muslim. It was right at the time period when smartphones are starting to really make their hit. And how sad it was to see people, like, seriously, father and son, mother and daughter, sitting at the same table, each of them on a smartphone, not even talking to each other.
That's all of us, I think. That's all of us.
Well, not only that, it's the idea that we acknowledge a lot of times, and it depends. It's generational too. We acknowledge as adults many times that we might be addicted to our phones. So many people complain about marriage problems. Oh, my husband's always on his phone. My wife's always on her phone. And then we give our kids phones. On the one hand, we're complaining about it. And then the other hand, we're just reinforcing that. And so it's like as if we're giving them carte blanche to just here, kid, go ahead and check out of the family. Here's your smartphone, here's your tablet or whatever.
The other irony is that when they're young and our kids would love nothing more than our attention and our affection, we give them the smartphones to distract them. And then when they're teenagers, they want nothing to do with us, and they don't want our attention, and they don't want our affection, and we wonder why. All of a sudden, we start wondering what happened. We've trained them. We've trained them from the beginning that we didn't have time for them, that they weren't important, and we've given them the license, in essence, to pursue that attention and to pursue that relationship elsewhere. Eating together. This is something immensely important. This is something the Prophet ﷺ actually talked about. There was a group of people that came to the Prophet ﷺ and they said, Ya Rasulullah, we eat and we're never full. And the Prophet ﷺ said, his first question, he says, do you eat together or do you eat separately? So we eat separately. And so the Prophet ﷺ said, eat together, you'll find barakah, you'll find blessing in your food, and you will be full. These days, we overtax our children with scheduled activities to the point where we very, very often don't sit down to eat even one meal together a day, or perhaps one meal together a day. This is a tragedy. Whenever you want to, listen, your child is more valuable and more intelligent than a horse or an animal, but whenever you want to train an animal, what do you use? You use food. That's because we have this expression in English, the way to someone's heart is through their stomach. There's something that happens when you sit down over food together and you put all distractions aside and you turn to each other and you talk to each other and you engage with each other and you express in all those nonverbal ways how much you care about the other person. This is something that's going to strengthen your relationship with your child. That's going to strengthen your credibility with your child to the point where they will be open to the sort of education that you're trying to give them. Worshipping together is another huge thing. This is sometimes out of our control. Sometimes the local masjid, they kind of frown upon children coming. They're too noisy. They make too much mess. They do this, they do that. But other times, even within our own homes, we're not praying the sunnah there. We're not reciting Quran. I want everybody to just think about how many minutes in a day your child sees you worshiping Allah in your home. How many minutes a day do you worship with your child at home? Do you pray together? Do you recite Quran together? Do you say Bismillah together? Do you make a dua together? Do you just recall a story from the Sunnah together? The other thing, in addition to devices, is about the time that and this is another thing that detracts from our relationships with our children, is how much time they spend with our peers. We live in what's called a peer-oriented society. When I was growing up, and this is another thing that comes back to the Disney movies and the media, and what's every single representation of a parent is that they just don't understand. Will Smith's song. They just don't understand. Where are they supposed to turn? Something happens in their lives. They turn to their friends. Their friends, of course, don't know any better than they do. Their friends, of course, are constituted by these cultural forces as well, and not by any sort of traditional wisdom, not by any sort of divine guidance. And so the problem compounds itself.
Can I add to that you know, not to underestimate these things in terms of education. This is education. We talk about tarbiyah and ta'aleem. We think about education as just this ta'aleem, like I'm sitting down and I'm teaching you something. Listen, this is what you have to do to be a good Muslim. And we forget that all this interaction, this is all, and what tarbiyah is, it's more expansive than that. And it comes from, this idea of nurturing and taking something and taking it to its full potential. And that all occurs in the context of interaction and relationships. So you can think of these everyday interactions, whether that be eating together, whether that be things like your family everyday routines that the kids can look forward to, or they just know it gives them a sense of stability when they know that every day we're going to be eating together and we're going to be hanging out after dinner and doing this or doing that we at bedtime, our parents say salam to us and they say the dua with us or what have you. That stability it brings to their life, and that the relationship that develops from that's developing their self, their self in that paradigm, that Sheikh Tom talked about as a servant of Allah. And, you know, many times our family life is just so disjointed and so, you know, it's something they want to run away from. They want to run away from it. And it's not something, and I don't know if you're going to mention this later, or maybe this was just when we were discussing it another time, the idea that, you know, you're supposed to be, the home is supposed to be like a refuge for your kids. They should feel this sense of a coming home, you know. So I think the term, do you remember the term for that? The peer orientation, and there's one about drawing them in. What was the term for that? Do you remember what it's called? It's something like a reconnection. Essentially, you know, whenever your kids are away from you, whether they're at school or even at home, they're oftentimes disconnected. They're doing their homework, or they're on their device, and you have to reel them into you, whether that be reconnecting with them, sitting down, you know, and this type of drawing them into the fold, so to speak, is critical. Yes, exactly. The home is maskana. That's really beautiful. Yes, and sakina, you know, this peace and tranquility, all of these terms, you know, come together. As a homeschooler, so there's a question, as a homeschooler, should we, quote, choose their friends though, or is it good to have friends who will challenge them as long as they communicate with us?
Is your child ready to be challenged? That's the question you need to ask yourself, right? I compare children to plants. And you start a plant in a greenhouse. I actually used to be a farmer, another job. I've lived many lives, by the way. I used to be a farmer. I used to be a waiter, all these sorts of things. If you take a seed and you put it in the ground, let's say you plant a whole field or something, what do you think is the percentage that they're going to germinate? It's only about 10, 15, 20%. It's not very good. If you try to germinate those same seeds in a greenhouse, it's usually about 90, 95% that they're going to spring up. When you want to grow something, you start it out in a place where you control the environment. You control the temperature, you control the humidity, you control the water, you control the diet, until that plant is strong enough to be introduced to the outside. And even then, you don't just throw it, say Bismillah, and just throw it out and say, okay, you're on your own now. No, in stages. Usually what farmers will do is they'll put it out during the day when it's a sunny day, and then at night they'll take it back in. They'll do this for a week or two. And then eventually they'll put it into the ground when it's finally ready. So your child's the same way. If your child is that well-developed, strong plant, strong roots, knows who they are, knows where to turn to for help, has open lines of communication with their parents, is able to talk to them, brings the hard stuff to their parents, then okay, then maybe they can deal with some challenging friends. But if that's not you and that's not your child, then I would suggest, and maybe the other two panelists would disagree with me, but I would suggest that you be very careful about who your child chooses as a friend. And in fact, that you just not be a negative force of removal and say, no, you can't be with them, no, you can't be with them, no, you can't be with them, but match makes for your child. Just like you would find your child a mentor or a tutor if they were suffering in math, that you would try to make relationships with other righteous families, other like-minded families, other similar families that have children at similar ages with similar interests. That, as a parent, is, I think, a primary responsibility. But what Merium said, I don't know if she wants to talk about that in specific, but what she's saying about relationships, what does it have to do with education? What are we talking about? Exactly this. The society outside is going to tell your children that every relationship they have is an oppression upon them. If your relationship with your child is so sweet, like the relationship of the Prophet ﷺ to everybody around him, that they can't wait to come back, that they miss you. If they go away to college, they're like, oh man, like it was so hard being without you guys. Maybe I should commute. These sorts of things, then you're in a winning position. You're set up for success. But if your home is one where your relationship is frayed and you haven't given your child attention, and they can't come to you with hard things, then what's the pull? Everything in society is calling them to go elsewhere. You've helped them. You've helped them with that call. So that's the significance of talking about your relationship and building strong relationships when we talk about education.
And there's a cultural component to this too. I can just speak for, the Desi culture, Indo-Pak culture, in the sense that, we have a very strong, in our culture, focus on achievement, which is good. That's fine to focus, and it's important to focus on achievement. And there are various reasons for that, especially, we look at immigration and, how our parents had to, I'm speaking from the perspective of the United States, how our parents, had to come to this country and had to make a life for themselves. And however, a lot of times what happens, and by the way, this is not just in the Desi community, there's a very interesting book called The Price of Privilege. And it's written by a counselor, a therapist who deals with the teenagers of the upper and middle class, and how basically parenting for many of us has become a type of management. We're just managing them. We're managing their schedules. We're waking them up in the morning. We're getting them to school. We're bringing them home. We're feeding them dinner. We're making sure their grades are good. We're taking them to activities. We're making sure they are in bed on time. And it's like they're this tool that we're just managing it. And if we're not actually having that relationship, well, nature abhors a vacuum, and they're going to get that relationship from somewhere else. If it's not from you, from the parent, it's going to be from their friends. That feeling like meskana, that feeling of that peace and that feeling of coming home to rest somewhere will be with their friends. And for many of us who, grew up as Muslim kids going to public school, you guys are probably familiar with that and how you say it in English, that sense of like a dual self, where here I am in the school one way and I'm at home one way, and you just can't wait to get back to your friends at school because they understand you. Your parents don't understand you. It's no fun being with your parents. And so, this is, and actually, let me come to the main thing that she writes about in that book. So what are the consequences for that? The consequences when we talk about today, the high rates of depression, suicide, substance abuse, this, and you hear about it in the news. So-and-so student, straight A student, valedictorian of their class, on the football team, they commit suicide. And this is not an uncommon picture. This is not an uncommon picture. And if it's not suicide, the title of the book is, it's called The Price of Privilege by Madeline Levine, Levine. We can maybe come up with a resource list. But many, if you talk to people who are in college right now, substance abuse is very common, very common. And we're talking about good kids. They're taking prescription drugs to help them get through college. They're buying each other's Ritalin and things like this. And so what she says is that you as the parent, if you don't build that emotional connection and you're just managing your child, on the outside, your child looks very well adjusted. They're doing good in school. They're a good kid. Behind the closed doors, they are suffering from this depression, this anxiety, but you don't see it because you're just more concerned about managing their schedule and managing their homework. And if you don't build that connection where you can see, hey, what's going on? I'm seeing that, you're seeming like you're a little down or this, that, and the other. And if you don't have the time to even notice these things, then, these are the kids that end up falling through the cracks and really suffering. And so that's, she's writing from a secular standpoint. And what about the kids who maybe they don't fall into depression or suicide? Maybe they do. Many of them, we're not immune to those. Maybe they just lose their religion in the process, you know, because we're just so concerned about these outer trappings that their soul, their heart is becoming hard because we're not paying attention to that. Social anxiety. I think social anxiety, I'm not sure what the question, maybe if you can give more details, but in other words, like, we want to be able to recognize these things is what I'm trying to say. And we can't recognize these things if we don't have that connection. So if either of you guys want to take from there.
One thing I just wanted to say in response to Layla's question about ideas, resources, I would just say that ritual, finding habits and rituals to get in with your kids that are just fun things to do that they love. Think about yourself, like think about the things that you remember from your childhood that you look back upon and you're like, wow, that was really, really nice. And all that, you know, a lot of them are really, really rich sensory experiences. We used to go to this certain place every week and we used to do this certain thing. And I always remember that we, you know, and those like memory rich experiences, that's what you're essentially trying to engineer with you and your child. One thing I do with my son every night, we read together, like you know, not just like a bedtime story. We just like read about a chapter from a book or something. His choice. Like I'm not like gonna be too preachy. I'm not gonna be too controlling about it. And then we just literally just like lay next to each other and talk. And then until he falls asleep. That has been such a huge thing in our relationship. Like that time, he often comes to me with stuff that is troubling him, with stuff that he really liked that, you know, that happened during the day. It's an open end it's an open lane of communication for your child and you to really connect. And it's just free, unstructured time, just you one-on-one. Another thing we do like a game night, like one day a week. It's like, even if you have multiple children, you can have like a special, a specific night for each child to stay up and play like a board game together. And then, you know, all the other kids go to bed and everybody knows that they get their night to just be up with the parents and, you know, like play a board game or whatever. Again, of their choice. You don't want to be too controlling or else then they don't have any stake in it. There's a lot of different things that you can do. We do like pancake breakfast. We do something called pancakes and poetry, where we make pancakes my son actually makes the pancakes every Saturday morning, and we read from a book of poetry, like everybody like around on a table, like whatever, like stuff for kids, you know. There's so many things you can do. It's literally endless. You can make popcorn and watch YouTube videos on the Siraj or something like that. Any sort of ritual thing where your child is looking forward to it and they're anticipating it and it's something that they can count on, you know, like it's something that they tell other people about. Like those are the sorts of things, like the real bread and butter that you're looking for to like really, really, you know, keep your, you know, your relationship. Relationships were just one aspect of what we're talking about here. We're talking about how to develop the sense of Islamic self or the sense of self in Islam to your child. Relationship is where it all begins. But there's other things as well. One of those things is responsibility, especially responsibility to older generations. We talk about having responsibility within the home, like chores, or having responsibility to contact certain relatives, whether they're writing letters, or whether they're participating in phone calls. Like a lot of us have relatives abroad and things like that. And those sorts of things, what we're trying to do is develop a sense that, yes, you have a responsibility to the people who went before you. You have a responsibility to the older generations. Not so much that they're feeling like this is just some horrible, oppressive thing, but enough so that it's there. And the most important thing is that you model that as well, because a lot of times we expect our children to be very, very respectful to our parents, like to their grandparents and to their uncles and things like that. And then when our brothers and sisters leave and go home, the first thing out of our mouth is we talk bad behind their back. We disrespect them, or we talk to them on the phone in a not nice way, or we don't even communicate with them except very, very rarely. So we lead by a poor example, and then we expect our children to be different. This is stupidity. that dovetails into the next point. So we have building relationships, developing responsibility, so people feel responsibility to, especially older generations and siblings and people that you have a relationship to. But another is the parent being a good role model in general, not just in this specific area. Children, especially intelligent children, they cannot stand hypocrisy. And if you do not practice what you preach, you will be exposed. Your child will expose you. And they are not old enough to be able to separate. They are not old enough or mature enough to be able to say, well, I know what he says is right, even if he doesn't do it. No, they're going to say that this person, all this thing is just wrong. I don't like any of it. They're all hypocrites. They don't do what they say that they're going to do. It is essential that you be the good example for your children in their lives. And that can be with anything. That can be with how you manage your emotions. That can be with, wow, like telling your child, I was so angry today at something that happened, but alhamdulillah, I was able to control myself. Or this person really wronged me, but, and I really didn't want to forgive them. But, I got up, Allah gave me the guidance to be able to forgive this person. All these sorts of things. When you're doing them, your kid is watching. They are taking notes. They are recording, and it is being filed away for how they're going to be. We say in English, the apple doesn't fall far from the tree. And that's just true. Your child isn't going to magically become some sort of amazing super Muslim when we ourselves are broken and we have a lot of work to do on ourselves. Yes. When it comes to what Priscilla says, when you're talking about, that's really nice what you do, like an interview. The one thing I try to tell my kids, and it's hard because they don't necessarily do it all the time, but I try to tell them that nothing makes older people happier than talking about the past. Asking them about how school was, how was food, how was growing up, all these sorts of things. And
that helps to fight against the individualism, because you're seeing yourself as part of a continuum, and the Prophet ﷺ stressed so much about silatul rahim, connecting the ties of kinship. Connecting the ties of kinship, is one of those things that gives so many blessings in your life, extends your lifespan, and so many things. And and that's how we learn wisdom too, from our elders.
And patience, because a lot of our older generations had it way rougher than we did. They sacrificed so much. Yeah, exactly. What are they going to last time? So these are all things that have to do with modeling.
And Tahira's point is really good there too.
I missed it.
Yeah, I'll read it out loud for the recording. Even if we don't succeed in being patient, apologizing and confessing to being wrong and asking the child to do du'as for the parent. That's incredibly humbling. That teaches the child humility, and it also lets them have a sense of trust in you, that and you're modeling that behavior for them, that they should seek forgiveness when they do something wrong, and that they should be humble enough to admit when they're wrong. That's really powerful.
It's also making the primary relationship between them and their creator. Because one thing I try to tell my kids all the time is that, listen, the constitution between us is Islam. And I'm going to make mistakes, and you're going to make mistakes. But whatever happens, if you come to me and you say, hey, Papa, you're doing this, it's not right in Islam, you have to change, then I have to go along with it. That way, it's not just about me. It's not just about listening to me just because I'm your father. I'm the adult. I'm the this, I'm the that. That will work until your child's a teenager. Then they're going to stop caring that you're their father. And they're going to stop caring that you're an adult. They're actually going to resent it maybe. And if they haven't had that primary relationship shifted to one between them and Allah, then they're just going to be one way in front of you and then a different way when they're out of sight. Which comes to another thing that we have when it talks about developing the Islamic self. and that is watching how we praise our children and what we praise them for. We tend to get our children hooked on praise. And this is, just the same as what we're talking about when it comes to authority. We want to be shifting to a point where the child is doing things for the religion and because it's the right thing to do, not necessarily just because it is just because the parent is asking them or the parent is praising them for doing something. But it's also a matter of what we are praising our children for. A lot of times we're praising our children for achievements and not virtues. How many times do we praise our children when they get good grades? We praise them for the result. What about the virtue of discipline? What about, wow, you must have worked really hard to get that grade. Wow, you've shown a lot of self-control. You've shown a lot of discipline. You've shown a lot of respect to other people. You've shown a lot of consideration with what you did to your sister. These sorts of things. We tend to praise results and not praise virtues, which are staying. We also tend to praise the essence of the child and not the practice that they're doing. So we say, for example, you're a good boy because you're doing X, Y, or Z. Which the understood lesson is, okay, so if I stop doing that, I'm not good anymore. Or you're this way, you're that way, you're that way. And especially when we blame our kids, the opposite of praise, then this can be very, very toxic for the kid. You never listen. You're disrespectful. You're this, you're that. And when we make it about the essence of who the child is and not about the actual practice that they've done, listen, what you said was very disrespectful. What you did is not becoming of a Muslim. These sorts of things, you're giving the child the opportunity to hope that they can get control of that behavior and right it one day.
There's actually an interesting lesson for this in the Arabic language. In the Arabic language, when you talk about nouns, so an ism has a sense of, you say someone is a liar, that they're kadhib. That has a sense of dawam, like they are lying. That is their characteristic. It's going on all the time. If you say so-and-so lied, and you use a verb, then what that is verbs carry a sense of time, past, present, future. And so you're just making a statement about an action versus saying that you as a person have this inherent characteristic. And we have this in the English language as well, but it's something that is explicitly discussed, in Arabic grammar. And, and pay attention to this in the Quran even, the use of nouns to describe people versus the use of verbs. Yeah, exactly, Sister Farida. Yeah, that the verb is caught in time, whereas a noun has a sense of continuity. So when you're telling a child you are blank, and you're using a noun to describe them, it means, and in Arabic it's very explicit means. In English maybe we don't realize this, but it gives that sense of it being an inherent, descriptor for that child that follows them, and that's not accurate. And we don't want to perpetuate those concepts in the child's mind.
So all of these things we've talked about, they have to do with trying to build up this sense of self in your child. Building up an Islamic sense of self, one that is where you have a strong relationship, where you develop responsibility in your child, where you're modeling what you're hoping your child will become, when you're praising your child in an appropriate way, but also trying to get them to attach themselves to the virtue itself for the sake of Allah. Now there's another side, because sometimes it's not enough to just build the positive. Sometimes you have to address, especially as your children get older, have to address the negative. You have to address these other ideas and conceptions that are out there in society and that most of our media takes for granted And most of what's even written these days takes for granted. Why do we do this? How do we do this? When you address something specifically, when you highlight that something is actually going on that nobody is talking about, then you make it manageable. You make it able to be kind of compartmentalized, to understand that this thing isn't very obvious or necessarily true. Especially when you name it, when you specifically say, you can sit down with your child and tell them, listen, you're going to hear a lot of things. People are going to try to tell you that you own yourself, or that it's all about you, or that your parents are dumb and that they don't know what's best for you, or that your friends know better than your parents do. When you name something, it does something to take away its power. And this is something that the LGBTQ movement realized when they started describing people as cisgender, right? 10 years ago, 15 years ago, we had never heard of what is cisgender. Why? Because if we only have people and then transgender, then transgender is an exception to the assumed default, right? If we have African American, Hispanic American, Pakistani American, the hyphens are the exceptions. What we're saying, in essence, every time a hyphen is used, that the default is not that. The real American is not hyphenated. The real person is not such and such. So when you go out of your way to name something, you say, look, this is what it is. You do something to kind of, you put it on the map. You kind of reveal, that the emperor has no clothes. You kind of show that this thing is there. And because it's there, then from there you can manage it. And as Sister Mariam said earlier, you have to be the people who talk about these things. If you don't talk about these things with your children, they're going to talk about it with somebody else, and they're not going to talk about it in a way that you like. Having hard conversations might be against our culture and our cultural background. It might be uncomfortable with us. But the society we live in dictates that we have to get involved in discussing hard topics with our children. Would you rather have your child exposed to the idea of homosexuality from the Quranic perspective as something that is a deviation and a sin? Or would you rather have your child exposed to it via Pride Month? By the way, it's June, we're in Pride Month, where everything is rainbows and beautiful and fun and individualist and happy. You only get one chance to make a first impression. You can compare your child to an empty cup. Whoever gets there first starts filling the cup. You can pour however much you want in afterwards, but the cup can only hold so much. If you are incapable of having these conversations, then you need to find an adult that you trust within the Muslim community that can. Whether it's an imam, whether it's a student of knowledge, whether it's another family, because you cannot sit on your hands and assume that your child is protected somehow from believing these things are okay, or even believing that these things are not a possibility for themselves. Polling, polling, it's the jury's out how accurate it is, but there's a lot of polling these days that shows that a very large percentage of Muslim youth believe that homosexuality is okay. It's not that big of a deal. Are there any videos or articles you recommend that parents watch prior to talking to their kids about homosexuality? I don't necessarily have any off the top of my head. What I would stress and what I stress with children when I talk about homosexuality, I use the euphemism as marriage. I say there are men that want to marry women, there are women that want to marry women, and in our religion this is not acceptable. And I bring it back to desire, because the principle is that our relationship to our desires is not one of complete reckless abandon and expression. It's not one where we base our identities off our desires. Our relationship to our desires is one of mastery and one of discipline. And that is not just in Islam. That is every single traditional society that has lived on the face of this earth. Yes, as Priscilla says, you want to make sure that the person that you trust are actually worthy of trust. You don't want to just turn it over to the imam just because he's the imam. Him being the imam does not make him qualified to talk about everything, especially when it comes to modern social issues. There are, as you said, plenty of imams these days that are pro-LGBTQ. There is an immense pressure, an enormous pressure to bow to the lobby. So you really, it's also another euphemism, kissing. That's to say like men kissing men or women kissing men. You don't need to be graphic. You don't need to be age inappropriate. You need to break it down in a way that is developmentally appropriate for your child. But it's important. Just because it's uncomfortable or just because, it wasn't what your parents did with you doesn't mean that the conversation doesn't need to happen. So this is all about building the positive, taking down the negative, building the conception of self that is harmonious, that is in harmony with Islam, and diminishing, or at least naming and problematizing ideas about who we are that are rampant and infecting our children. Now we get back to the whole purpose of this, education. And we're running out of time.
Yeah, actually, so for many locations, Maghrib time is coming up right now. So, we did get into many practical, I feel like, we got into a lot of practicality as far as within the home. When it comes to the classroom, I think that's something that perhaps we can take another session to explore that, unless if there's something maybe in the next 5 minutes or something, if you want to summarize.
I think we can do it in 5 minutes, no problem, inshallah. Okay, so the purpose that we're talking about here, everything we've talked about, is converting all of this into how we educate our children. So we want to forget about the idea that school is just the place for education, that our children are being educated just at school. We pick them up, then it's brain switch off. Every single moment we're with our child is part of their education. And it's your responsibility as the parent to inform them and to inculcate and develop within them the idea that their education is about, not just about themselves. It's about pleasing your creator. It's about taking care of your family and representing your culture and taking care of older generations. It's about being a benefit to your community and being a benefit to the creation like Allah wants us to be. And finally, it's about prioritizing these sorts of relationships because we live in an era that is heavy on the information. We live in the information age, right? So everybody else in society is is trying to stress to your children to focus on the facts and focus on the dates and the names and everything like this. You don't have to worry about that. Your children are going to get that. What we need to focus about is the whole person, developing these things in our children, these habits and these virtues, and tying their relationship to that of their religion. And inshallah, there's more to be said, but I think everyone has to go pray. Walhamdulillah, wallahu a'lam, wa sallallahu ala nabiyyina Muhammad, subhanahu wa bihamdika, astaghfirullah wa atubu ilayh.
Jazakallahu khairan. Are there any questions or comments to conclude? I want to point out, you can click with a show of hands. There's a raise hand button. Is there interest in continuing this discussion in terms of for the classroom, application in the classroom or in the home? You can click the raise hand button. I also just want to go over before you leave. I'm going to put in the in the chat box the link. Let me put the link in the chat box. It's the Muslim Academy.themuslimeducator.com. We have a few classes coming up that are, you know, incorporate some of these themes that we're talking about. So Brother Tom is going to be doing a class called The Struggle for Sincerity. And in that class, you know, it will help to solidify some of these concepts. Well, not what we were talking about today, but the idea of sincerity and what are impediments in the path to sincerity. And we have different age sections for that. So we have 8 to 12, we have teen, and we have even an adult section. And so take a look at that, inshallah. Brother Siraj is going to be doing a class on Surah Yusuf and taking this kind of approach, looking at the story of Surah. And Surah Yusuf is great for looking at relationships, looking at some of these touchy issues. And so he's going to be doing that in the summer. And for myself, I have in the fall Juz Amma, and hopefully we'll be listing a book club, A Wrinkle in Time, coming up in the end of the summer. So inshallah, you know, hopefully in the future we can have some further discussion on this, but I appreciate everyone coming out today and participating. What we will be sending out a recording and posting it on YouTube, so you can follow up with the discussion. Any other final questions or comments before we conclude? All right. How do we, you're throwing in a curveball right at the end. So how do we instill the concept of haya? I don't know. Do you want to take that, or how do you want to, is that something you have time to address?
I would begin, yeah, we don't have time to address all of it, but I would begin with, again, our relationships with our desires. That's the fundamental thing, because our entire society is about licentiousness, with literally the sense of license to do anything that you desire. And talking about the devil, talking about the how the devil works on people, vanity. I mean, the opposite of modesty is vanity, right? So when somebody has the internal intelligence to know what's going on inside of them and to know how the devil works on people, then they can begin to identify exactly what's happening, because the devil's going to provide all these sorts of rationales for why this sort of behavior is okay, immodest behavior. But in essence, those are the two main aspects in my mind. Our relationship to our desires and the reality of the devil and how the devil works.
Yes, we have no shortage of class ideas. I wish we had all the time to do all the classes. Yeah, that's an excellent topic. I'm going to link you to the YouTube channel, and I started doing a class for my kids on haya, so there's a short talk in there. Hopefully, you know, I did that, you know, before things kind of started picking up in the summer. So hopefully once we settle down over the next month or so, I'll be coming back to that. But that there's a little bit of a starter there for you. All right, Jazakumullahu khairan for everyone. Jazakallahu khairan, Sheikh Tom, for preparing the presentation and delivering it for us today. And please keep in touch, everyone. Subhanakallahumma wa bihamdik, ashhadu an la ilaha illa ant, astaghfiruka wa atubu ilayk. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Wa alaikum.